Now available in paperback and Kindle Unlimited. Isis, Imitation of Life. The Goddess Next Door helps a young black girl overcome racism during the era of Jim Crow in this Golden Age Isis series adventure. Get Isis, Imitation of Life in paperback and Kindle Unlimited today.
In a previous video, I talked about the controversial ending to Mortal Kombat 11 featuring one of the characters, Jackson Briggs. And in Jackson Briggs' ending, when he defeats Kronika, the final boss of Mortal Kombat 11, Jackson Briggs gets the power to shape the sands of time, and he uses that power to shape the sands of time in order to end slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. Now, many of these comic book fanboys and gamers, they are saying that that ending is racist, and what's even more troubling is some of these black gamers are saying that that ending has something to do with identity politics. Now, I don't see where that ending has anything to do with identity politics, because when it comes down to African American fantasy and science fiction, African American fantasy and science fiction has always been connected to African history, and it has always been connected to black history. So if you go to any black fantasy writer like myself or any black science fiction writer out there, they're going to tell you that when it comes down to fantasy, it has always been tied to history. So it can't be racist for your Jackson Briggs to use power to end slavery, and the whole fantasy idea of him ending slavery should be something that should fit within the whole concept of fantasy, which is designed to give people an escape from reality. But when I take a critical look at all of this controversy and uproar over Jackson Briggs using his power to shape the sands of time to end slavery, it shows me how deeply entrenched white supremacy is in the mind of many black people. Because when it comes down to white supremacy wants to be able to dictate how black people think and even how black people imagine the world around them. And that's what's really troubling here. You have even some of these black gamers sitting there trying to say that this idea of Jackson Briggs ending slavery is racist, and that just shows how deeply entrenched white supremacy is in the minds of black people, that they can't even think of imagining themselves with this great power and using it for themselves to empower themselves. And the only thing that I believe they're looking for is white validation and white approval. Because when it comes down to many of these black fantasy characters out there that companies like Marvel Comics produces, like in the case of your Truth with the so-called first black Captain America, or your Blue Marvel, these characters, they can exist in a world where they have these great powers, but they always seem to want to submit to the foundations of white supremacy. And it's okay for a character like Blue Marvel to have these incredible cosmic powers, but as long as he submits to the power of white supremacy, he's allowed to exist in the world of white supremacy. And nobody will get upset at that character Blue Marvel for having that great power and not using it to try to make something for himself or empower himself. But the minute Jackson Briggs starts talking about using the great power he gets to shape the sands of time, that's when people start to have an issue with Jackson Briggs. And I believe the reason why many have an issue with Jackson Briggs and want to make the identity politics argument regarding Jackson Briggs having this great power is because they are terrified at the idea of a black man having such great power. Because when it comes down to many in the comic book world, many in the sci-fi world, many in the manga world, they only want to see black men as these big, strong bucks who have all of this great physical power and are looking to follow the lead of the white male characters. And the whole idea of a black man having the intelligence and the confidence to lead himself and the power to make a world all his own, this is something that terrifies many in the video game world, many in the comic book world, many in the fantasy world, and many in the manga world, because the whole idea of a black man having that kind of power, that shatters their smooth world, and it shatters their whole ideas that they create in their own fantasy world regarding the black male image, and it shatters their narratives that they have regarding the black male image. Because it's okay for Jackson Briggs to be the big, strong black man who can go out here and beat up on all of these Mortal Kombat characters. That's okay for many gamers, but the whole idea of a Jackson Briggs having the power to create his own reality and create his own future for himself, that's something that's too terrifying for them to think about in the whole perspective of a fantasy world. So that's something they have trouble with as related to fantasy, because they want to see their fantasies regarding the white male image and the other non-black images out there. That's what they made their fantasy worlds for, and I believe that's what was too real for many people, because all of us who have been writing African American fantasy, like myself, we learned how to think outside of the box, and we know how to imagine ourselves in a world where black is first, where black is the leader, and black people have power. And we know how to imagine a world where black people use power without seeking white validation and white approval. And that's where I believe people have the real issue with the whole quote-unquote identity politics issue, is that black people are being seen in light where they're not seeking white validation or white approval. And that's what has many of these racist fanboys very uneasy, and many of these black gamers uneasy, because some of these black gamers, I believe, seek validation and approval from white people. And because they seek validation and approval from white people, that's why they're saying that this is some sort of identity politics. But I don't see where there is any sort of identity politics, because as a writer of black fantasy, I've created a character called John Haynes, and the John Haynes character, he has great power as the CEO of Morris Phillips and Corporation, where he's taking on Lucifer and Lucifer's Legion, and he's thinking primarily about using that great power to help others, and he primarily thinks about it from a black perspective. So I understand where the Jackson Briggs character was coming from, because he was coming from the same perspective that the John Haynes character was coming from in terms of using that great power. And when I was writing another book, ISIS Imitation of Life, I was showing how black people had great power even during the dark pit days of Jim Crow, when segregation was going on in the South and discrimination was going on in the North. And in that book, where I was paying homage to the golden age of comic books and Pulp Fiction, which featured characters like Doc Savage and the Shadow, I wanted to make a point about how black people were seeing themselves as heroes and what was a hero, to black people at the time. And I wasn't thinking about anything as related to identity politics when I was writing ISIS Imitation of Life. I merely wanted to show how black people were heroes and how we saw the world of heroes during the darkest days in black American history, a period, again, where black people were treated as second-class citizens, black people were seen as less than, and black people found a way to find value in self by working towards doing for self. And I wanted to show that we did heroes in a different way, because that's what was related to that time. Because during the golden age of comics from the 1930s up until the 1950s, there were no black heroes in comics outside of maybe your whitewash, who was a coon caricature, or a couple of other guys who were in Pulp Fiction. There were no real superhero comics that featured black lead characters, and that was because there were no black publishers at the time to publish comic books, and there were no black publishers out there to publish Pulp Fiction featuring black lead characters. So I understood what was going on then, and that wasn't anything to do with identity politics. That was something that had to do with history, and that's where a lot of black people need to get things, an understanding of things, so that when people come out here with these identity politics arguments, oftentimes they want to go out here and use this as a way to try to deflect from efforts to try to bring actual diversity. Because when I look at this Mortal Kombat ending, again, I don't see any sort of racism involved here. I don't see any sort of identity politics, because, again, when it comes down to African American fantasy is tied directly to African American history. And I know this because when I was writing the first ISIS back in 1999, I had to look at racism and white supremacy, as I had the ISIS character in one chapter killing Ku Klux Klansmen after the tragic loss of her family. So I understand the dark legacy of slavery. I understand the connections to black history. And I understand if you're going to do a fantasy story, you're going to have to deal with the dark period of slavery. You're going to have to deal with racism. You're going to have to deal with these things, because if you're going to write black characters in a fantasy story, they're going to have to deal with the harsh realities of slavery. I've had to deal with those harsh concepts when I was writing the first ISIS back in 1999, and I also had to deal with them as I developed the ISIS character over the last decade or so in stories like the Thetas and stories like ISIS Imitation of Life. So I know that when it comes down to black history, this is something you're going to have to confront. And I believe the creators of the Mortal Kombat game understood this with the Jax character, that there was no way of getting around slavery. It was not an identity politics issue. It was a history issue. And this, sadly, is a part of American history, whether your gamers and your fanboys want to confront it, and confront it in a way that gives people an understanding of things, or they just want to deny it so they can say, oh, it's just another black character. But it's not just another black character. If you're going to talk about timelines and history, you have to acknowledge all of the things related to that timeline if you hope to come to an understanding more about the things that people went through. So when I look at Jax ending slavery, again, I don't see it as anything racist, nor do I see it as a part of so-called forced diversity or identity politics. I see it as something organic to the character's history, organic to the character's development, and something a black man would do if he was given power over something great as the sands of time, looking to change the course of history to not only benefit himself, but benefit all of his people and all of the history of his people, so that they wouldn't have to go through one of the greatest tragedies in world history because the transatlantic slave trade dehumanized people, it devalued people, and it made all of humanity all that much more worse in the big picture. Now, if I can come to that understanding about black history and black fantasy, I'm hoping that others, especially black gamers out here, can come to that understanding, because when it comes down to black fantasy, you really can't have great black fantasy stories without a great understanding of black history, whether it be the slave trade or slavery, because that's all a part of black American history. If you'd like to learn more about African American fantasy that talks about racism and Jim Crow, you can pick up the first ISIS book, or you can pick up ISIS Imitation of Life. Both books will give you a bit more understanding of the concept of white supremacy on the black mind and on what black people did to be heroes during the darkest period in black American history. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.
Now available in paperback and Kindle Unlimited, E-Steam Goddess of. Hell's aspiring angel takes on a demonic dominatrix in this action-packed all-new E-Steam series adventure. Get E-Steam Goddess of in paperback and Kindle Unlimited today.